We have spent decades telling women to ask. Ask for the raise, ask for the promotion, ask for what you're worth. Women listened. We negotiated, we advocated, we leaned in. But what happens when women do everything they're told and still pay a price? Because after more than 20 years as a trial attorney, I've learned something difficult. And that is that negotiating for yourself is not a protected activity under the law. And the backlash women experience when they ask is extraordinarily difficult to prove as sex discrimination, which means many women walk away believing the problem was them, carrying shame, feeling alone, and keeping themselves small. But what if the problem was never you? What if the problem is the system? Today's guest has spent 10 years documenting the ambition penalty and why there is no truly safe way for women to ask for more. And if that's true, perhaps the answer isn't trying harder alone. Perhaps it's telling the truth together. Stay with us. I am JoDee Neil, a former prosecutor, a survivor, and the author of Outcry Witness. This is Outcry Witness Unspoken, where we say what the system won't. Thank you so much for tuning in to Outcry Witness Unspoken. My name is JoDee Neil, and I am beyond excited to introduce you to my guest today. Her name is Stefanie O'Connell, and I found her on Instagram. All these years I've been following gender pay issues, and I am so excited to have her on my podcast today. She just wrote a book. Well, she's been writing a book, and the book was just published. It's called The Ambition Penalty. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of why you're not getting paid what you should be paid, in all likelihood, if you're working as a woman in America. Stefanie, thank you so much for being here. I am so honored that you took the time to be on my podcast today.
It is such a pleasure. Thank you for having these conversations.
Of course, of course. Well, congratulations to you on the publication of your book. Is this your first book?
I call it my first real book. I had another book published about 10 years ago, which is basically like a collection of blog posts. But this book I've been researching for almost a decade, and I spent years looking across the literature from economics to social science to psychology, sociology, public health, and really interviewing experts and people on the ground to synthesize and understand their experiences to bring some fresh insight into these topics we've heard so much about, we think we know so much about, and yet we still have so many misconceptions around.
Yeah. And to your point, I've spent the past few days just really immersing myself into your book. It's called The Ambition Penalty. And you really have read every study, you cite every study. Tell us about this journey you've been on to get a handle on what's happening in America.
So I have been reporting on work and money for a very long time. And specifically, I wrote about personal finance for a long time. What do I do to budget, to save, to invest? And a lot of the time, what I found was that people would be doing all of the quote unquote right things and yet not getting the same outcomes as their peers, especially women. And where I really saw this disconnect was in workplaces around the advice around leaning in, asking for more, speaking up, asserting ourselves. Women who did all the right things, followed all the best practices, checked all the boxes. And yet when they asked for more, they didn't necessarily get the same raises as their male peers. And often they faced backlash in the process. So I interviewed women who had job offers rescinded for negotiating. I interviewed women who were labeled too difficult to work with, not a good fit, ungrateful, not a team player. And what I started to see was that these were not one-off incidents. This was part of a pattern that is backed up by data. This is not something that's happening once in a blue moon. It's something that's happening with regularity, where the very ambition women have told to implement to get ahead is being weaponized against them in ways that reinforce these gender gaps in pay, in power, and in leadership.
Wow. As you know, my background, I'm an attorney, and I've done employment cases before on the employee side. And until your book, I really couldn't understand why I was seeing a pattern too. And I was thinking, well, how am I going to prove this? I know this has got to be a gender issue, but how do I prove that? And so when I saw the press for your book and started watching you speak on your book topic, I was like, you know what? I think this is the missing the piece of the puzzle. And having read your book, I am confident that it is. I want to back up a little bit and talk about what we have been told. You grew up in America, I grew up in America. We grew up under the belief that in the American dream, all you have to do is work your hardest and the money will come, right? Is that actually real for American women in 2026?
So this is certainly a broader mythology than just kind of the girl power mythology I grew up with, right? I'm a 90s kid. I came of age in the workforce in the early 2000s, the 2010s. So I was sold this basically corporate feminist dream that if you just asserted yourself as much as your male peers, you could get the same results. And obviously that's not the case. But that's also part of, to your point, this broader story of meritocracy, the American dream, the belief that the biggest barrier to your opportunity and your success is you and you alone. And what this book really exposes is how much you can have the exact same input and get completely different outputs depending on your identity as the person doing the inputting. And so that is not an issue of individual behavior or capability or skill. It is an issue of a system that produces different outcomes for the same input. And yes, I take a gender focus in this book, but this applies across many different metrics. But what I do also want to point out is that this is not inevitable. What we know is that these systems can and do change all of the time. That's why you see in different contexts, in different fields, this plays out a little differently. Gaps are not as bad in some fields relative to others. And oftentimes the mythology is, well, that's just a skill issue or a preference issue or some other kind of construct we create to justify these gaps, as opposed to really what the research reveals is that when you are equalizing on inputs and getting different outputs, that is then not an issue with skill or competence or willingness to ask for more. It is an issue with the environment that rewards who does the asking or implements the skill differently. And so, yeah, there is this myth of individual effort leads to appropriate rewards. And I think if we all really interrogate that ideal ourselves, we know that's not true because we live in the world. You work enough time in the world, you see people who are where they are, not because they deserve it, but because of a million other reasons, right? They know somebody, they're just friends with this guy. And that is hard to accept because it challenges our own perceptions of ourselves. Well, I know I worked for my success, and so what I have must be because I worked hard. And that may be true, but the implication is also then that that's a universal rule. And that's what I'm really challenging through use of data. Just because it might be true for us doesn't mean necessarily that that's true across the board. And I think the data really shows us that it's not true across the board. Many people are working very hard and not getting access to the same rewards. And that differs so much across identity, as we see in the research.
Yeah. And your book is full of data. How many studies do you think you've cited in this book?
So I know the citation section is about 450 citations, and putting that together alone after the fact took me over a month because I had been linking through the studies as I was researching it and writing the book in my Google Doc. But as soon as I had to go back and find the authors and the pub date and everything else for each of those studies, it took me a very long time. But I really wanted to be grounded in data for the book because so often these conversations revolve around assumptions, and those assumptions are often wrong. For example, when we talk about motherhood in the United States, there is an assumption that mothers are inherently less interested in their career ambitions relative to those who are non-mothers or relative to fathers, and all these other things that we then say, well, the fact that mothers make 35% less than fathers on average somehow quote unquote makes sense. But that doesn't make sense when you actually realize that you are equalizing for hours worked or time in the workforce and commitment, and you really have to start to challenge your own assumptions when you look at the actual data. And so that's why it was so important to me to not only have these proof points, but then to really challenge every subsequent assumption that comes up from there. So, when you talk about gender pay gaps, people will be like, well, it's just because women are not interested in certain fields. And then you say, well, when women enter fields dominated by men, they're paid less than them. And it actually drags the average pay for both men and women down on average, showing us that this is a undervaluation of women's labor that hurts everybody and not something that women are simply opting into. And then the explanation changes again. We move the goalpost. Well, if it's not about the jobs women are choosing, it's about the hours they're working. And then you see the research that says, okay, well, when women just work as many hours, they're presumed to be less competent, not more committed, while men who work the same hours are assumed to be more committed and not less competent. So then the goalpost changes again. There's some new explanation. Well, that's just when women become mothers. Well, you can look at women without children. You can look at mothers who work just as many hours. You can equalize for performance and still see these gaps. And so what you have to do at a certain point of reckoning with the fact that every explanation you are giving us for why this makes sense isn't making sense is to confront the underlying assumption. And the underlying assumption is that women do not deserve to be paid the same as their male peers. And that's not something people are comfortable admitting to. But it is the underlying philosophy behind this tendency to try to justify or dismiss gender inequality rather than meaningfully address it.
You make the point, and it's really not that hard to accept when you consider that women in America have only had the right to vote for, 100 years. And globally, women enjoy only 64% of the basic human rights that men enjoy, and 0 countries on the planet have achieved full equality. In a lot of places, the UN is saying it's going to take 300 years. So, I think what you're describing, which is that we have a fantasy of the way we want things to be, but the data is very clear that is not the actual reality where we live.
That's exactly right. And even in the United States, we think about more recent history, things like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that allowed women to have their own bank accounts or to be able to get a credit card in their own name or take out a loan without a male cosigner. That happened in the 1970s. That was when my mother was an adult. So we're talking, I am her daughter. I am 1 generation removed. My daughter is 2 generations removed. That is how recent this history is. And that absolutely has a long tail when you're in a world in which women did not have equal financial access as recently as 1 generation ago. We're now talking about someone like me, who was raised in a household with the effects of that. And so there are norms and cultural things that stay within the kind of ideals of who's in charge of money, who should know what the savings are, what the investments are. And it's silly for us to assume that just because that legal barrier is now gone, that there isn't this still cultural stickiness around the ideas of who should have access to money and power in our culture. And I think what we're really seeing play out right now is this disconnect between the expectations for those of us who've been brought up in a
Yeah.
world after these barriers have been removed versus the culture that hasn't really caught up with the fact that, we're looking for models of partnership and equity and not models of domination or what is often called being like a provider protector model in terms of households and partnerships, for example, but in practice plays out as a kind of like domination and control model.
Right, right. One thing that's super interesting to me is that you had 450 sites for your book. But, I work in the field of, human on human abuse dynamics and power dynamics. And there's maybe 2-3 dozen. And so I wonder, why is it that this issue has been studied so heavily compared to, let's say, abuse of children?
Mm. I think one of the things that we see in terms of the literature and what gets attention is where is there enough outcry, enough
Mhm.
support, and enough infrastructure to prioritize these things.
Hmm.
I really find it fascinating how much of even what comes up in terms of discourse in media and my social media algorithms even isn't necessarily reflecting the natural interests and values of the American people, but rather the people who have money and power that shape our algorithms, that provide the money and the infrastructure behind the causes that get elevated. My feed, for example, is on Instagram is just dominated by trad wives and women who are performing an ideal of submission, no financial control, no financial autonomy. And that is not something that is representative of the sentiment of American women. And yet it is still overtaking my feed because those algorithms are optimized for outrage. They're optimized for clicks. They're controlled by people who have power and resources. And so that winds up shaping a lot of what gets studied, a lot of what gets talked about, even if that's not really reflective of what people want or our values or whatever's happening in the moment.
Right.
And so I always think it's really interesting for us to, as much as I like to take a data lens to things, the media literacy, the understanding of context around how these conversations play out, I think is so important.
Yeah. And, children have no money and can't vote. So they're not
100%.
building the infrastructure to study why they keep getting hurt.
And the caretakers of children are women, and women are
Yeah.
financially disempowered. Overwhelmingly, people who both care for children and I would argue financially care for children, because 45% of American mothers are the breadwinners in their households. So children are essentially their interests are really contingent upon the economic empowerment of women, and women are not economically empowered.
Wow. 45, according to the CDC, 45% of adult women in America have survived contact sexual violence. And then I guess they turn around and support the family even after they've been survivors of, abuse events in their life. We are incredible creatures, aren't we? I mean, think about that. 45% of women are supporting their families in America, but they've also been victims and are still managing to really accomplish miracles.
Oh, absolutely. Like we are coping through a lot of constraints. Even women with a lot of privileges, and I count myself among them. I'm a very privileged woman, but like the amount of constraints women are still facing relative to men on average is enormous. So the fact that they are succeeding at the rate that they are, the fact that they are managing the vast majority of care and raising the next generation while still being almost half of the financial breadwinners in the United States, it's remarkable. And so I think it really speaks to the power of how much more could we do and achieve if we realized that what we were going through was not a personal problem or an individual issue, but rather something that is collective and will be best addressed collectively.
Amen. Amen. And, I actually have hope, so much hope, because if you consider, let's just say that our starting point was when we got the right to vote, and now we have 64% of the rights that men have. That's actually pretty good for 110 years or however long it's been. We're going to get there. So the next thing I want to talk about, and you really helped explain this for me as someone who's done employment work, is that the act of asking for more or something, really anything, is what puts a woman in a workplace in jeopardy. And you described so well, and it's supported by so much data, that that's when the penalty hits. Tell us, do you have any idea why asking is not a protected activity?
What a good way of putting it. Why isn't asking a protected activity? Oof. I'm just processing that. Thank you for putting it that way. Yeah, so this really comes back to the stickiness of the legacy of women being disenfranchised. And when we think we have kind of gone past so much of this explicit discrimination, the fact is we're still being raised within these environments that constantly reinforce much more implicit ideals of what women can and should have access to and what men can and should have access to that are largely mutually exclusive. So, what we think from the moment we're born, and not what we think, rather what we're conditioned into thinking from the moment we're born, is that boys should be a very certain way and girls should be a very certain way. And when you violate those expectations and boys take on these characteristics that we associate or prescribe to femininity, they face retaliation. And when girls do the same with traits and characteristics we ascribe to masculinity, they also face retaliation. Now, the retaliation women face reinforces a lot of these kind of gender gaps that we've seen in power and pay and leadership, because pay, power, and leadership in and of themselves are stereotyped still as masculine. When I think about the word ambition and I change the pronoun in front of it, everyone listening probably will have a moment of thinking, when I say he's ambitious versus she is ambitious, how much it completely changes the connotation. He's ambitious applies a praiseworthy drive to succeed. That's the guy we want to work with. He's independent. He's a go-getter. Yes, we want to reward that. And that is because ambition aligns with those ideals of masculinity. But when I say she's ambitious, suddenly there's something negative to that. There's this assumption that she's selfish, she's difficult, she's too much. And that is because women are still expected to be self-sacrificing, deferential, and not claiming power for themselves. And when you want to get ahead in a world in which power, leadership, pay is really basically just aligning with the ideals or stereotypes of masculinity in and of itself, there's really no way for women to win. They're always going to be either in conflict with those ideals of femininity and penalized for that, or in conflict with the ideals of leadership and power because they are being quote unquote feminine. And so they're going to be held back for that. And so effectively, you have a very effective system for reinforcing the same discrimination, even as those more explicit barriers to women's participation fall away.
Yeah, yeah. And what you've described, as I reflect on my lived experience as, a lawyer who's done trials in front of juries, it's really a tightrope holding, a rod with two buckets. And you have to be, bold and courageous, and you have to try a case like a man. You got to fight largely a man lawyer on the other side in front of a man judge. But you have to roll your hair. You got to wear the hose. You got to be really feminine. It's a very fine line we have to walk. But even when you walk it, all you have to do is ask for what you're owed, maybe what they're getting. You suspect because you don't really know, and boom, like a sock full of pennies hitting you on the side of the head. And that is the problem, in my opinion, of working in an at-will state where negotiating is not a protected activity.
Yeah. I mean, you're describing this tightrope, and it's a tightrope of impossible double standards. Basically, you are set up to always be excluded for being too much or too little of anything. And when that is the case, you really can not only exclude and discriminate, but you can do it pretty freely because you can always hide it under these other explanations. One of my favorite papers that I reference in the book researched why women were excluded from leadership. And it wasn't people sitting around and being like, well, we can't promote her because she's a woman. No, instead, they found that women's other identity characteristics were weaponized against them through double standards that were not applied to their male peers. So a younger woman could be excluded for being too young to be seen as a leader. An older woman could be excluded for being seen as too old to be considered a leader, while a young man the same age as the young woman could have his age reframed as an asset instead of a liability. So he would be seen as fresh new thinking. He would be seen as the next generation of leadership and the guy we need to take us into the future, while an older gentleman would have his age also reframed as an asset, even as that same age was seen as a liability for a woman. He would be seen as a seasoned leader, having valuable experience, and just what we need again on the team. And in this paper, the researchers identified 30 different aspects of a woman's identity that intersect with her gender that were weaponized against them in this way, from age to race to parental status to even physical attractiveness. And so what I think it really exposes is not only is this inequality still so very much with us, but it is accompanied by this just layer of gaslighting on top of it, saying it's not even happening. We're not sitting around in circles saying women can't be paid the same. Nobody's saying you can't be here. There's no law preventing you from getting ahead. And yet what shows up in the data is case after case after case, these double standards are still so clearly at play. They're just hidden through these other means. And so that identity weaponization I just spoke about is one of them. And then, of course, this too ambitious, not ambitious enough, impossibly fine line is another one.
I think you should testify as an expert in employment law cases, because you may be the one person who's able to say, no. That's pretext. Look at what the data says. This is endemic in police work. This is endemic in office work. I want you to consider that, because you know this stuff inside and out. I am really impressed. I want to go back again to, you grew up in the 90s. I was born in 80. And so I've right out of just allowed a credit card, right into the world. And like you, I also owned a copy of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. And as I, really ruminated in shame over a workplace conflict that happened to me a few years back, I was like, I never asked. Maybe it's my fault because I never really asked. And then I was like, well, could you have really asked without getting fired? And I've landed on no. I don't think that me raising a real conversation about it was safe. And so let's talk about the impact of Lean In and how we are self-reflecting, and whether it's creating shame for us not doing what we think we could do, which could also get us fired. I mean, we don't know what to do.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's not just that Lean In didn't really acknowledge that doing the same things as our male peers doesn't get us the same results. It's also the way it reinforced the idea that if you don't get the right response and if you're not getting ahead, that's a you problem. It basically conditioned us into blaming ourselves, such that when we did the same thing and got a negative response, we felt shame. And we were conditioned into that. We were conditioned into that through, I would say, a lifetime of this messaging of believing that the only barrier to your success is you. And I'm not saying there's nothing we can do as individuals. I obviously work very hard. You obviously work very hard. But I think what the data reveal is that working hard is not something that spares you from inequality. It's not something that spares you from backlash or discrimination. And in fact, it can be the very trigger of people coming for you because they perceive your power as a threat, especially if you are a woman or someone else from a marginalized community. And so when we are taught to self-blame, when that backlash happens, we turn into ourselves with shame and we don't say anything because we've already been conditioned to believe that the problem was us. And so we get caught in this cycle of thinking, oh man, it must have just been me. Maybe I really didn't ask the right way. Maybe I really was too much. Maybe I really was too little. And how convenient then? How convenient for the system that never has to be confronted for the fact that it responds to the same request differently across identity. And also how effective a way of silencing women.
Yeah.
Because when we're taught to shame and believe the problem is us, when we do face that backlash, we don't want to share it with other people because we're so embarrassed. We really believe the problem is us. And so we go inwards into ourselves instead of looking out into the environment around us to really assess how it's treating us differently when we do the same things. But what I found was that as soon as people felt a sense of permission to share what they had experienced, the backlash, the bad behavior with other people that have been through similar things, all of a sudden it became a chain reaction. This happened to me too. I wasn't alone. And they started to then get the pattern recognition and to be able to realize, oh, it wasn't me. It was part of this broader ecosystem and the environment I'm in. And then they were able to go move through the world with a lot more confidence, self-assuredness. We often talk about this idea that women lack confidence, but what women do is accurately read the environment they're in. They understand that they have to be hypervigilant in a world in which violence against women is endemic, backlash against women is endemic, and people are constantly looking to put women down. And so what we see reflected in women's behavior is the real proper assessment of that experience and adapting to survive the environments they're in.
Yeah.
And you cannot thrive when you are surviving.
No. I like to call this phenomenon, you're not crazy, you're correct.
That's
which is
a perfect way of putting
intuition, right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
I love the way, your work and my work, there's actually a large Venn diagram where there's overlap because shame is the silence multiplier. For everyone, and this is really relevant in the workplace because, the labor laws protect employees of the same strata for asking what the other employee makes. You're allowed to ask another, kind of line level person, but management and ownership do not have to say, it's not protected to ask at that level. And so when you get those of us who are in our late 30s and, 40, 46, for example, we're going to be hitting the management, the partner level, the director level, and we really aren't, we're not going to ask another director, another partner what they're getting paid. And we're not protected if we do. And so we don't have any real visibility about what's normal, what's systemic. In absence of that visibility, we feel ashamed, just like we always have in so many other aspects of our lives.
And this is why things like transparency are so valuable. And in the absence of them, whatever we can do to cultivate it interpersonally, I think is important. Right now, we're seeing a lot of institutional rollbacks in some of these initiatives. Like, on a local level, depending on where you are, there are some places where transparency around pay, for example, is required. But even that is being, the kinds of transparency is being worked around. They're finding loopholes. They're rolling back commitments. The amount of companies reporting the representation of women in their leadership and on their boards just dropped by double digits. And it's really concerning because we know that kind of transparency is one of the most effective ways of addressing a lot of these gaps, even in the absence of any kind of explicit initiatives to improve representation. Just the virtue of the information itself winds up being a very effective tool because it forces people to confront the reality instead of gaslighting us with these narratives of why things are the way they are or why they make sense. And it forces people to have to really confront biases and to be held accountable for them. And so in this environment where we're seeing this kind of rollback, I think it's so much more important that even if that kind of institutional transparency is going away, we foster it interpersonally. And that means sharing these stories that we have had instead of being shamed into silence, because that really is our most powerful tool of coming together. We realize then we're not alone. We realize it's a pattern. We realize it's playing out at scale. And then we really are able to break free in a way that we can't when we're just internalizing all of it.
Yeah, you are so right. And, from my experience, I'll tell you, I did the opioid litigation for 6 years, and, you may as well be asking for the keys to the kingdom by trying to find out what any one of the executives make, any one of the sales with commission employees made. I mean, I literally had them under oath in deposition and would not tell me what they made.
Oh, I believe you. And that's a really good point. Even with the sales and commission, it's okay, even I'm in New York, and so we have pay transparency laws, but then the employers are hiding things in bonuses and benefits. And so you wind up having some things out in the open, but then that can create its own kind of story that doesn't reflect reality. So I think the vigilance that we kind of have to practice around this stuff and not be gaslit is so, so important when we have these conversations, because people are really going out of their way to cultivate misperceptions to keep us disempowered. So much of this inequality is only enabled through the upholding of these myths, through this obfuscation, through this misperception. And so I want us to understand that this is a practice. This is not a box we're going to check and it's all going to be solved. This is something we have to constantly be talking about, thinking about, pushing back against, resisting, because that's the way it changes.
Yeah, and certainly lawyers and the legal system has a real role to play here.
Oh, yeah, and, big time.
In Texas, anyhow, it's really hard to find an employment lawyer to take a case. There's really no hope unless it's discrimination. Unless you can prove a pay gap case, it's hard. Anyhow, moving right along, enough talking about lawyers. But, even lawyers, that you think, oh, surely in law, surely there's more equality there. No. I mean, if you look at the data on partnership tracks at big firms, it's pretty bad.
One of the opening anecdotes in my book is from a young attorney, and her basically being told she was money motivated for negotiating her salary, and how she had been in the workforce for just a couple of years, and she really was having this reckoning moment of coming from law school, where women are the majority of
Yeah.
graduates and have been now for quite a while. And I think this is a bigger story beyond law, too. You know, we've been talking so much in recent years about how women are going to college at higher rates than men. And I like to point out that that has been true for over 4 decades in the United States. Women have been outpacing men in higher ed. And then in specialties like law and medicine in the last few years, we've seen, again, women outpacing men on these metrics. And yet, when you look at every step along the trajectory up into the levels of leadership and partnership, you see the same old patterns playing out. And that is, again, 4 decades after women started outpacing men in college ed. And so what I think that really forces us to confront is this idea that progress is inevitable, or that education alone will save us, or our skills alone will save us. There's no amount of education and expertise and outperforming that overcomes a system that is designed to put you down. What you have to do instead is call out those systems of bias, and you can't do that alone. You have to do it in partnership with other people. So that's why I think the data is so important. That's why I think sharing our experiences is so important. And that's why each chapter of this book focuses on the kinds of policy changes, environmental changes that actually shift outcomes, instead of telling just individuals to shift themselves.
Right, right. And I love that your book came out around the same time as All the Cool Girls Get Fired.
Yes.
You know, so that we can build that community and release ourselves of some of the shame that is so unnecessary, because it is, across the board. It's not just me. It's not just
Exactly.
you.
It's not in your head.
Together.
It's not in your head. It's in the data. It's not just you. It's all of us. And I think there is this desire to be exceptional, which I understand. I'm an ambitious person. Like, I do want to do excellent work, but I think there is a difference between what it takes for a woman to get ahead and what it takes for women collectively to get ahead. And I have become more and more interested in this process, in that second one.
Yeah.
In what it takes for women as a social class and all of the diversity that entails. What does it take for women together to succeed? Because when we do that, it raises the floor in a way that will naturally make the ceiling higher.
Right.
And I think so often we have focused on raising the ceiling. And I do think women in leadership are very important. I have a lot of data that show women in leadership, and having them represented there is very important. But what I also see in the data is that if you have a woman in leadership who is getting there just by means of wanting to get to leadership, the best path for her to do that is by reinforcing a status quo that puts other women down. So we have to think more expansively about what it means for, again, women, all women, to get ahead, and work on building our solidarity more than our exceptionalism, because I think building our solidarity will make that more possible for everyone to be exceptional.
You're so right. And, we have at-will states because there was solidarity through unions. And that is 100% what has to happen. And you see these memes, well, not even memes, they're posters, women supporting women, girl power, the best women are the ones who lift each other up. And then you very clearly hear about the queen bees. You talk about this in your book, the queen bees. What is that phenomenon?
Yeah. So it's so interesting. I as you said, I talk about it in the book, and I wound up dedicating a whole chapter to this kind of like myth that women in leadership will solve everything, because it's complicated. In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So let me break it down a little bit more. A single woman in leadership doesn't materially change outcomes for women in an organization. But unfortunately, because of gender discrimination, that is often how women are represented in leadership, as tokens. They're elevated into roles of leadership often as a cover for maintaining the discriminatory and exclusionary practices within that environment. Because then the men in leadership can say, hey, we're not biased against women. Look at this woman on our team. And really, she is being elevated in that position to serve as a cover for those practices and misogyny and the kind of old boys club environment. And what we see in the data is very clearly that once a woman is elevated into a position of power like that, the chances of another woman being elevated in the same way drops by about 50%. So that really tells us that this is an exclusionary strategy as opposed to an inclusionary commitment. Now, what we do see is that as soon as you get women meaningfully represented in leadership, not one woman or two women, but women represented at scale, at around the 30% mark is where it really starts to make a difference. Because then those women who are leaders cannot have their voices and perspectives sidelined by the rest of the men on the team, because there's enough buy-in to their ideas that they don't have to simply conform to the culture to stay there. They can start to meaningfully push back, not completely push back, but enough that they can start to change those kinds of exclusionary systems and the culture of the workplace itself. And so what we see is that as women's share of leadership increases, gender pay gaps and promotion gaps throughout the organization start to close in a meaningful way. And in fact, a recent paper in the UK found that when about 60% of those workplace managers were women throughout the organization, all gender gaps disappeared. And so that really says something to us about what we think is going on with women in leadership versus what's actually happening. What happens is often this idea that, well, women are just as bad as men in terms of how they treat ambitious women. And there is a truth to that. There's a truth to the idea that we've all been conditioned into this idea that women shouldn't ask for more. And so even if we are women ourselves, we also respond negatively, knee-jerk reaction to women who ask for more, because that is the conditioning we've all been socialized into, no matter what our identity is. But what the data is very clear about is that when women have an opportunity to build solidarity and meaningful representation with one another, the outcomes for women all across the board improve.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that UK study. It is, there is so much hope. There is so much hope. But the hope begins really when we know that there's an issue, when we stop living in the fantasy that everything's just fine and it's my fault, as we do with a lot of things in our life, and connect to the reality that you described so clearly in your book. Now, you're a journalist. Are you sort of thinking about becoming, a lobbyist? I mean, do you want to go to Congress with me and let's get some work done?
I mean, I don't know if there's really, speaking of like where the money and power interests are, I will say that there is not much infrastructure behind women's issues.
Yep.
So I don't know if there's a real path for me there. But hey, anything I could do to advance this, I think is important. And I think, to be clear, I think this is important for everyone to care about across identity. The data is very clear that when women's outcomes improve, everyone's outcomes improve. In part because women are the primary caretakers of the next generation, often the financial providers for the next generation. Also, most households rely on men's and women's incomes. So women being economically disenfranchised is a problem for everyone. And as women are paid more and treated better, men benefit from that too. It changes the culture, a culture that allows everyone to combine things like caregiving responsibilities and their professional ambitions more sustainably works better for everyone. It's not just a women's issue. And we see as gender equity increases, things like standards of living increase for everyone. Longer, healthy lifespans are better for everyone. There is less collective violence for everyone. And so really there is a huge benefit to literally everyone and the culture and the next generation when women are treated with equal respect and care. And unfortunately, a lot of this inequality is reinforced through this false idea of zero sum, that if a
Yeah.
woman is succeeding, then they are taking something from me. And I think we have got to really dispense with this idea that women's power is a threat to men's, instead of understanding that women's power is a net benefit for everyone.
Yes. What a great note to end on. You know, this is an economic issue, really. And we need absolutely to empower everybody in the family to have the money that they need so that it's our kids who will win. You know, it's not so women can just put the money into a hedge fund and, you know, feast off the dividends. No, it's so that we can pay for horseback riding lessons, do that extra activity, send them to the nice summer camp where maybe they won't get molested by counselors and then the camp say it's okay. You know, there's a lot of things that we all want for our children, and more money in the family means better lives for our children. And this is a humanity issue, an economic issue, and you are doing such important work getting us the data, the studies in a way that we can digest it. And I'm really grateful to you for your book and for your work.
Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Of course, stay in touch with me. I'll give you my cell phone number and I'm here for you anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today on Outcry Witness Unspoken. This has been a very important conversation about how we can strengthen our families through just simple fairness for people working at workplaces. It's not much to ask. Thanks again.